Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, lovers of history, literature, and activism. I am Barbaralee Diamonstein-Spielvogel, the chair of the Historic Landmarks Preservation Center, a large group of dedicated individuals committed to informing the public about the past, present, and future of our city. And today, the past is present. Our warmest thanks to the board of 2 Fifth Avenue and to all of you for joining us here today to commemorate the remarkable life and work of author and activist Larry Kramer. For those who asked, today's Zoom program will be recorded and the video made available through the Diamonstein-Spielvogel Video Archives, part of the David M. Rubenstein Rare Book and Manuscript Library of Duke University. And now our program. Called one of America's most valuable troublemakers by writer Susan Sontag, Larry Kramer was born in Bridgeport, Connecticut, to what would accurately be called a struggling middle-class family, a struggling middle-class Jewish family. He was the younger of 2 children, and like his father, 2 uncles, and his older brother, Larry attended Yale University. Unlike them, he felt he didn't fit in, saying later that he believed he was the only gay student on campus. That severe alienation drove him to a suicide attempt, an aspirin overdose. But it left him determined to better understand his feelings and his sexuality. In 1957, he was graduated with a degree in English, and at the age of 23, entered the film industry, first as a teletype operator, and then he was promoted to the story department at Columbia Pictures, where he reworked scripts. His first writing credit was on a 1968 teen comedy, Here We Go Round the Mulberry Bush. The following year, he wrote the screenplay for Women in Love, an adaptation of D.H. Lawrence's novel that was nominated for an Academy Award. His next credit was a 1973 musical remake of Frank Capra's Lost Horizon. It was a critical and commercial failure. But the well-negotiated fee, skillfully invested by Larry's well-known, successful lawyer, older brother, helped make him financially secure at the time. By the 1970s, Larry began incorporating gay themes into his work and started to write for the stage. His groundbreaking works include the best-selling novel, Faggots, 1978, a satirical and hard-hitting exploration of gay relationships, the 2-volume The American People in 2015 and 2020, and a reimagination of our nation's history. His 1985 play, The Normal Heart, won a Tony Award in 2011 and was adapted into an Emmy Award-winning film in 2014. He also won 2 Obie Awards and a Primetime Emmy Award. He was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for Drama for his 1992 play, The Destiny of Me. Also the recipient of an honorary doctorate from Yale University and the American Academy of Arts and Letters Award in Literature. Although Larry had not been involved with gay activism, in 1981, when friends started to become sick, he took action. He invited a group of gay men to his apartment to hear a doctor affirm that these illnesses were related and that significant research was necessary. From From that meeting came the Gay Men's Health Crisis, the first organization to raise funds for and provide services to people stricken with acquired immune deficiency syndrome, AIDS, in the New York area. While GMHC concentrated on social services for men who were dying, Kramer started to insist that it was time they started to fight for the living and for funding from New York City. In 1987, he gave a galvanizing speech that led to the founding of the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, or ACT UP, an international protest movement whose street actions called for a speed up in AIDS drugs research and an end to discrimination against gay men and lesbians. Larry Kramer's legacy is manifold as an activist and as a writer. His righteous anger helped shape our understanding of the world and our views of each other. And now our speakers gather today to honor his memory as a writer, an activist, a friend, and a husband. Our first speaker was born into a California family with deep theater roots, 5 generations of women who had been on the stage. Gail Merrifield moved to New York City to attend NYU and took a job reading plays at the then brand new Lincoln Center Theater. In 1965, she became Joe Papp's assistant. They married in 1976, and she was a leader of the Public's literary department from 1965 to 1991. And that's especially important for today because she was responsible for the development, nurturing, and creation of countless shows, including Larry Kramer's The Normal Heart. She's been a public board member since 1991 and has served as a research collaborator in the publication of Free for All, Joe Papp. Like several other guests today, she has a book that will be published sometime this year. She's already written a memoir, Public-Private Life with Joseph Papp and the Public Theater, to be published shortly. Gail Merrifield Papp, a warm welcome to you.
So, as Barbaralee has just said, I was working at the Public Theater as the head of its play department when Larry Kramer submitted his now famous play, The Normal Heart, to Joe Papp. And at that time, I had read The Normal Heart and been deeply moved by the bewilderment and anger of the play's characters as they struggled with the official silence that prevailed at that time about the exploding number of cases of AIDS across the country and in New York City. Its leading character was a gay journalist who writes scathing indictments of the mayor and the New York Times for ignoring the AIDS crisis. However, the character's angry accusation against public figures upsets his co-founding partners of a gay health organization, which then expels him and his lover dies of AIDS. When I called Larry Kramer and arranged for us to meet, I had already been told about the rocky history of his play, which had been rejected by numerous producers and directors. And I'd also been warned about Larry's well-known confrontational personality due to his anger about the inaction of city, state, and federal officials. However, when Larry walked into my office at the theater with his dog, the man I met was polite and genial. and I would venture to say good-humored to the point of being jovial. Although I knew his play needed a considerable amount of work, I told him only about all the things that I had responded to in it and how powerful I genuinely thought it was. When I paused for a minute to tell him about something that I hadn't understood about one of his characters, he whisked a notebook from his briefcase and started writing furiously. I thought, well, that was interesting. But then he returned it the following week and had done some rewrites, which were really quite excellent. So we went on meeting in this kind of informal way. He seemed to like the fact that I asked questions because when I did, he felt that when he tried to clear a point up for me, that it became clearer in his own mind. And I found that he had a great capacity and eagerness to rewrite, which was really quite extraordinary. It was very serious and professional in its execution. So we continued our meetings for a number of months. And I found that he had this great facility and eagerness to rewrite, which is not always usual with playwrights. And after several months of these meetings, I introduced him to Joe, who also read the play at that time and had been just as moved by it as I had been. So I'm going to fast forward now to the following year, 1985, in April, which is when the play opened at the Public Theater. During previews, and Joe and I attended all of them, we had noticed that at the end of the play, groups of men didn't leave with the other theatergoers. They stayed in their seats and didn't move. We noticed that some of them stared at the stage, which was empty. Others seemed to weep. Others whispered amongst themselves. And later we would see them downstairs in the lobby of the Public Theater, talking in very low voices amongst themselves. And this happened every night. And it was a kind of witnessing of what was going on then that was very powerful and very, very moving to us. When the play opened, we had a meeting backstage of the cast and crew and everyone involved as Joe read the review to us, which was an ancient custom in those days because this is long before the cell phone had been invented. There was no other way to know what was in the papers. So as Joe read the review to us, it was quite clear that the critic had not liked the play very much. And in fact, he'd been strangely unmoved. So when Joe got to the end of it, there was this eerie silence in the room with all the people gathered there, obviously disappointed and sort of shocked. But then Joe said to us, every so often, maybe once in a decade, if even that, we have a play that can make a difference and affect the world we live in. I believe Larry Kramer's The Normal Heart is that kind of play, and I'm going to run it in this theater as long as I possibly can because its presence is so important. The Normal Heart then became the longest running play in the history of the Public Theater. And It won that same year the 1985 Olivier Prize for Best Play in London, and the National Theatre of Britain voted it one of the most important plays of the 20th century. 5 years later, it had generated an astonishing 600 productions in 18 countries. 26 years later, it finally won on Broadway the Tony Award that it had so long deserved. As Joe looked back on the conservative landscape of the 1980s, he was grateful that he was able to say that Larry Kramer's play put us in touch with the world again. And he also felt that it had ushered in a new era of national consciousness, which indeed it had. It was a proud moment for the public theater and for the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. Our next speaker is Bill Goldstein, the founding editor of the book site of the New York Times on the web. He reviews books and interviews authors for NBC's Weekend Today in New York. He is also the creator of public programs at Roosevelt House, the Public Policy Institute of Hunter College. He is the author of The World Broke in Two, Virginia Woolf, T.S. Eliot, D.H. Lawrence, E.M. Foster, and The Year That Changed Literature. He has received a PhD in English from City University Graduate Center and is the recipient of a number of prestigious writing fellowships, including from the MacDowell Colony and Yaddo Retreat. And he is the official biographer of Larry Kramer, and his book will come out sometime, we hope, in the very near future. Bill Goldstein.
Thank you, Barbaralee. Larry found his apartment at 2 Fifth Avenue almost 50 years ago in 1973 and found what he knew immediately and for all the ensuing decades was his true home. Being at home at 2 Fifth Avenue was, I think, a key to all that Larry achieved. And for Larry, being a writer and an activist were intertwined, especially in that place. He wrote Faggots there. He wrote much of The Normal Heart there. He wrote The American People there. And just above where the medallion is placed were the meetings Larry hosted that gave rise, as Barbaralee said, to GMHC. That is, when the noise wasn't distracting or enraging him, he changed the world with his AIDS activism, but he was never able to quiet down the park. He learned to talk a little louder, or maybe I think he always known how to do that. Larry was born in Bridgeport in June 1935, and when he was still a child, his family, his father George, his mother Rhea, and his beloved brother Arthur moved to Washington, D.C. But none of the places they lived felt like home to Larry. He always felt different from Arthur, who was 8.5 years older and an athlete and a brilliant student, and he spent a lot of time alone in his head, disappointed by a mother he felt was more interested in her work with the Red Cross than in him, and by a father he thought had no drive or ambition, and who seemed to him a failure, which Larry resolved he would never be. All of this was at the root of why he loved 2 Fifth Avenue, a place where he could be at home with himself. He always wanted to be a writer, a comedy writer, he told me, and he got into the movie business after graduating from Yale in 1957. In 1961, he moved to London to work at Columbia Pictures as a story editor. Larry's first major success, as Barbaralee said, was the movie he produced and wrote the screenplay for, Women in Love, based on D.H. Lawrence's novel and released in November 1969. He was nominated for an Oscar for that screenplay in 1971. And on the afternoon before the ceremony, he wrote a note to himself. He was not expecting to win and was at peace with that. I must remember that that picture would not be up there giving pleasure to many if it were not for me. Remember, this was one of my reasons for going into films in the first. With all the other people who helped me, I have made it possible to give pleasure to many, as Mother helped many with the Red Cross. I have kept up the family tradition. Writing is important. Short stories and scripts and plays and maybe novels, that was his ultimate dream. Don't be afraid. Larry went to Hollywood again in 1975 to try to sell an original screenplay that didn't sell. And on his 40th birthday that June, he felt adrift. He wrote in his diary, "Now remember something. 2 Fifth Avenue is the one place I have been happy. Also recall the euphoria and joy at the freedom writing there. Ergo QED, you have a place where you are happy, where you can write, create. The answer is plain." He left LA within a couple of weeks to begin writing Faggots in his apartment overlooking Washington Square. For Larry, the answer remained plain for the next 4 decades, urgently so in particular, as he wrote the second volume of The American People, published 4 months before he died, and worked on the play Destiny of Me, which remained unfinished. "I don't like to have my obsessions interrupted," he told me. "I think about it, writing, all the time." For Larry, as I said, writing and activism were one thing. "I guess what motivates me is what is right and what is wrong. It's not complicated," he told me in 2019. "That's why coming up against AIDS in 1981, it just wasn't fair how they were ignoring us. And the problem with living as long as I have," he said, "is coming up against it all again with Trump, which is depressing." Depressing, but Larry kept writing and never lost course or his cause for long. Use everything, he'd urged himself in 1971, and he continued until the end to use everything in himself. He hoped to be remembered for a life well used, as he put it. To move back to New York from London in November 1970, he made a commitment to himself from which he never wavered and that became the guiding principle of his life. The last 2 sentences of his London diary are a promise to himself. "I am going back to New York to find and be gay, and it ain't easy to do." It wasn't easy in 1970 for Larry and others then, and for so many LGBTQ people, it is still not easy, and it's getting harder. As Larry saw, we are coming up against it all again. But if there has been progress for getting us here, for leading an open gay life, and for his example that we must use everything in us, that our rights and our lives were and are at risk. Today, we are honoring Larry with a cultural medallion, a lasting memorial to the work he did and to the man he was. He pointed a way and helped save many lives and wrote as much and as furiously as he did until he died to help save others and to memorialize those we have lost and are losing, to claim their place and ours in the history of the American people. When I told Larry's lifelong friend, Anne Brown, they met in high school, about the medallion, she was thrilled and wrote to me, "Hope his father knows." We know. Our ceremony today is virtual, but the medallion, like Larry's world-changing accomplishments, is real, there for all to see at 2 Fifth Avenue so that everyone can know. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. You've given us ample evidence why we hope you will now leave this program and start writing furiously so that we can hear the rest of this really remarkable story unfold. Thank you for your participation.
Thank you.
And now Will Schwalbe. Will is a New York Times. Where are you, Will? Hi. Will
Hi.
Schwalbe is a New York Times bestselling author. His new book, We Should Not Be Friends, will be published by Knopf in February 2023, and we look forward to that eagerly too. Will has a big background, illustrious background in publishing and in writing. He was the former editor-in-chief of William Morrow and then Hyperion. He is now executive vice president of editorial development at Macmillan. He's also a journalist, and his articles have appeared in the New York Times and out the Wall Street Journal and the South China Morning Post. Maybe you'll tell us how they got there. Will has served on the board, here's counterpoint, of the Kingsborough Community College Foundation, the Yale University Press, Thames and Hudson, the Asian American Writers Workshop, and on the Hammett and Hellman Committee. Who's a lifelong friend of Larry Kramer. Kramer's book, The Tragedy of Today's Gays, is dedicated to Will. He is an advisor to the Larry Kramer Initiative at Yale and is an executor of Kramer's estate and Kramer's literary executor. It's a privilege to welcome you here. Will Schwalbe.
Thank you so much. And first, my enormous thanks to Barbaralee Diamonstein-Spielvogel and all her colleagues at the Historic Landmarks Preservation Center for honoring Larry Kramer with this incredibly richly deserved cultural medallion and for this celebration. In the late 1950s, Larry Kramer had recently graduated from Yale and was working as assistant to a Broadway producer. Sitting right next to Larry was a young woman who had also recently graduated from college. She was working for a different Broadway producer. They were young and full of energy and ambition, and they both loved New York and the theater. They became dear friends and would remain so all their lives. Yes, it was very Doris Day and Rock Hudson, but without the romance. Actually, completely Doris Day and Rock Hudson. Now, the woman next to Larry was my mother. And that's why I knew Larry literally my entire life. As he liked to put it, he knew me before I was born. When I was 16 years old, gay and just about ready to come out of the closet, Larry was the first adult I told. He soon became a mentor, friend. I got to edit him, and we even collaborated him. And as Barbaralee mentioned, I'm deeply honored to serve as the co-executor of his estate with David Webster and as Larry's literary executor. Now, in the minutes I have today, I want to tell you a secret about Larry that really wasn't such a secret because it was known to everyone who visited him here in his apartment at 2 Fifth Avenue or in the country, or whoever got to share a meal with him. And that is that while Larry was famous for being a fearsome combatant, he was actually as much a teddy bear as he was a warrior. He was funny, warm, supportive, often silly, and filled with love. It's no accident that Jean Carlamusto called her wonderful documentary about Larry, Larry Kramer in Love and Anger. Love came first. Larry loved writing, and he was brilliant at it, creating some of the greatest works of our time, ones that will stand the test of time. Larry loved being gay, and he loved gay people. As he wrote at the end of the tragedy of today's gays, quote, "I love being gay. I love gay people. I think we're better than other people. I really do. And I passionately and desperately want all my brothers and sisters to stay alive and well on this planet." Larry loved David Webster, whom he famously hit in the face at the pantry in Fire Island, a scene only barely fictionalized in Faggots, and whom he later married. David Webster was the love of Larry Kramer's life, and everyone who met Larry knew it. Larry loved his brother, Arthur. Larry loved his Wheaton Terriers, Molly and Tiger, and his cairn, Charlie. Larry loved Yale most of the time. Larry loved New York all of the time. Larry loved books and theater and movies. Larry loved fixing people up. He was a matchmaker and quite good at it. Larry loved chocolate. Larry loved the clear-eyed wisdom and prophetic words of Hannah Arendt, and Larry loved everybody who is on this Zoom today. And Larry loved life. Against all odds, including staggering medical challenges, he clung ferociously to it. Larry fought fiercely, but he loved fiercely as well. I think that's why he fought so hard. Larry's righteous rage changed the world. He saved countless lives through the power of his voice, on the page and in person. Mine was one of the millions of lives Larry saved. When I walk by this building, I think of all the time I spent within it with Larry, but also the years when Larry would stand on the balcony of his apartment during the annual June Gay Pride Parade, as throngs of proud gay people and our allies passed underneath. I will never forget the thunderous cheers that would erupt the minute the marchers caught sight of Larry Kramer on his balcony, in his overalls, or an ACT UP t-shirt, or both, waving. Larry loved us. He really, really did. And he put that love into spectacular action. I want to end with some words that Larry loved. They're from the W.H. Auden poem, September 1st, 1939, which, in a different stanza, gave Larry the title for his most famous work, The Normal Heart. Here are the Auden words. There is no such thing as the state, and no one exists alone. Hunger allows no choice to the citizen or the police. We must love one another or die.
Thank you, Will. Thank you very much for that eloquent contribution. We look forward to your book too.
Thank you.
Our next guest is political activist Peter Staley, who was an early and influential member of ACT UP New York. He was diagnosed with AIDS-related complex in 1985 while working as a bond trader on Wall Street. He joined ACT UP New York shortly after its founding in 1987 and chaired its fundraising committee for 3 years. In 1988, he became a full-time AIDS activist, and in 1992, became the founding director of the Treatment Action Group, TAG, T-A-G, which successfully lobbied for the radical restructuring of the nation's research efforts on AIDS. In 1994, Staley was appointed by President Clinton to the National Task Force on AIDS Drug Development. He also served on AMFOR's Board of Directors from 1991 to 2004. By 2000, Staley launched a website called AIDSmeds.com, offering complete and easy-to-read treatment information for people living with HIV. Appointed in 2013 by the governor to New York State's, quote, ending the epidemic, end quote, task force, he helped develop a blueprint to dramatically lower statewide HIV infections. He is a primary figure in the Oscar-nominated documentary, How to Survive a Plague. Staley's memoir, Never Silent, was published by the Chicago Review Press in October 2021. We're very pleased to welcome you, Peter Staley.
Thank you, Barbaralee. It's great to be in this group. I always like telling the story of my first memories of Larry. I joined ACT UP right after its first demonstration. I was only 26. Had found out I was HIV positive a year and a half before that, at the age of 24, and had been deeply, deeply closeted. So when I joined ACT UP, I had not heard who Larry Kramer was. I knew no gay history. But over the course of the next weeks and during that summer, we would eventually meet. Larry recalls that he met me at a demonstration that we had up at Roosevelt Hospital, that we walked the line together and talked for a bit. But my most distinct memories of him were after the Monday night meetings. The hardcore act uppers, the one who were living it 24/7, would all walk south to a restaurant, a dive of a restaurant called Woody's, and we'd eat a late dinner and have lots of drinks and continue to process what had happened at the meeting and strategize about the direction of the organization, the direction of this new movement. And that's where I got to witness what all of Larry's good friends know well, and that's the mensch. That's the guy who is very curious about your life, who's really, really sweet and a bit shy, actually, at times. Now knowing all the pieces of most of Larry's life, I think I can safely say that I saw Larry at his happiest at Woody's. Here was this new movement that he had pushed for years, and it was happening, it was working, and it was building, and it had already, made its imprint. And we were he called us his children. We were his children. He was a father figure to me for sure. And he was just beaming at our energy and our passion for what we were putting into the movement. So, we do forget that ACT UP was born 6 years into the crisis. Those were lost years as the country and its president ignored a new virus that was slaughtering a community they despised. Larry told us to fight back. And in short order, we guilt-tripped an entire nation of people and 2 Republican presidents to react. By 1990, the AIDS research budget of the NIH hit $1 billion a year. It was a movement that caused that sudden shift, but Larry was its spark. Those tax dollars resulted in treatments that keep 29 million people with HIV alive today. I'd be remiss in saying that the friendship that developed over the years didn't have its bumps. We disagreed a lot on the side of Larry that moralized about the gay community quite a bit, what I considered his finger wagging. We butted heads on that quite often. But the side of Larry that is unimpeachable, that I think is his greatest legacy, was the anger. And it was that anger that actually launched the 2 main branches of our community's AIDS response: the beautiful self-care response that gay men's health crisis valiantly built while the world looked away, and the activist response that forced that same world to look and respond. I think he'd be tickled by this plaque that's going on to Fifth Avenue. I think the only thing you would wish for more is if his plaque could be put over on top of Ed Koch's plaque. And he got the last word there, but I know that's probably not in the cards, Barbaralee. But thank you for having me as part of this event. I miss Larry.
So do we all. And thank you for your part, for your information, and I hope to become you. Larry directly told me where he would like his citation to be placed, and I sort of teased him, Larry, back, saying, firstly, it'll be long after I'm gone, and secondly, what makes you think you'll be considered for one? Well, that started an entire really interesting conversation, as was yours. Thank you for joining us on this really memorable day of, you can only call them testimonials, to, as he said earlier, a life well used. Now, the remarkable Sheila Nevins, television producer non for I, was the president of, where's Sheila Nevins?
Here I
Yeah.
am.
Thank you, was the president of HBO documentary and family programming from 2004 to 2018. She produced, listen up to these numbers, please, over 1,000 documentary films for HBO, and is one of the most influential people in documentary filmmaking. She has worked on productions that were recognized with 35 News and Documentary Emmy Awards, 42 Peabody Awards, and 26 Academy Awards. Sheila has won 32 individual Primetime Emmy Awards, more than any other person, and received, not surprisingly, the first Emmy Lifetime Achievement Award given to a documentarian. Welcome, Sheila Nevins.
Thank you, Barbara. I was Larry's friend. I was an odd friend to have. I forced myself on Larry because I was working on a documentary about him and I had never met him. And I had been warned that this man was going to be cantankerous and difficult and was not going to like me. And it turned out differently. And on his 81st birthday, I wrote a poem for him. And I was afraid to give it to him, but I showed it to dear David Webster, his husband. And David said, I think Larry will like it. And then I showed it to Larry because I was afraid if I read it in front of this gathering, I might be, I know he might be begruntled. And I showed it to Larry and he put thumbs up. So I knew I could read it. So I'm going to read that poem that I really wrote about Larry on his 81st birthday for Larry and to Larry. I was also called Tao. David, that was my nickname, as David will tell you, and that meant the other woman. And they'd say, Tao's coming on up, and that was me. So I got used to that name as well. Anyway, here's my poem. A documentary on Larry Kramer had to be made, but I had to know him. I had to know him to use certain segments of his life. They said he was sick and in a hospital, and so I forced myself to make bedside visits. This led to an adoration of this gay icon. He had survived all the vulgarities of a liver transplant, HIV, and the maladies of 81 years of passionate living. Darling Larry, evolving into my muse. Who would have thought? At first, a stranger with me at his bedside, telling me all my boring stories while lying about how good he looked. He in Gaga land about a land of hoped recovery, occasionally bursting through with an insight. Pick your fight, Sheila, he once said to me. I had been asking him why he didn't move on from seeking a cure for AIDS. What about cancer, I asked. How dare I ask him to change goals when his fight had saved so many lives? How many men at how many events we went to would bow down and thank him for saving their lives or their lovers or their friends or their children? No normal heart. This heroic man had the heart of Odysseus. How could I tell this hero anything about my life or anything else? Was he just tolerating me? Was this fake familiarity? I was there because I had to know this man for the film, but I didn't expect to fall madly in love. I loved that he fought to get healthy, defying odds once and once again. I will not die, he seemed to say. I will not be forgotten. Yet death hovered and he was challenged. And then slowly, as if a miracle not to be believed, he kept getting better. I loved that he looked forward to me and appreciated my visits. We fell in love over a hospital bed as I fed him applesauce. Have another spoonful, Larry, I begged. And I also bought you an energy drink of papaya juice mixed with a raw egg. Oh my God, awful, give it away, he said. But I think it makes you feel healthy. I'll get healthy without it, Sheila, he said, but thank you. I played him show tunes on my iPad and we hummed and sang the lyrics we both knew. I bought him headphones for hearing better, even a bird cage to celebrate the first day of spring. Once strangers, befriended over curious details. Who wrote this? What plays were revivals? What was worth seeing? What was today's zeitgeist? There I was, a straight, once young, pretty docu-maker with a great hero, both passing prime, but raring to go. I couldn't wait to see him each time, to watch his singular fight against impending death, and then to see him marry his beloved David Webster. We had nothing yet everything in common, raging insecurities. He encouraged me to write some stories, and so I did. And then I wrote more, and then he said, they're good. On many visits, he would disclose that some other historical figure was gay. He had proof, he said. Mark Twain. Oh, yes, he was a Clemens and used a pseudonym to hide his identity from his mother. And then there was George Washington. And then there was Honest Abe, not so honest. And then, of course, Hamilton. Is there anyone who was straight? I would ask, laughing. Larry took this seriously. I even began to wonder about myself. I asked him, what do you call a straight woman in love with a gay icon, a gay hetero? So I laughed. It was now to be LGBTQ-GH for me. Love for me was Larry. Once he suggested we run away to some island. He was on drugs. You see, Larry was and is the most romantic man I have ever known. He made me feel pretty no matter how wretched I looked, and any visit would dissolve any of my headaches. He would say he missed me. When was I coming again? He wanted my visits, that I lifted his spirits. I felt this lover's vibrancy and that I was truly wanted. I've never been so inspired. How dare I banter with a king? I heard he was cantankerous, so I must be a worthy subject. I heard he was difficult, not with me. I never found anything but courage, longing, love, respectability, genius. Can you imagine this icon tremulous about his abilities? He continually questioned himself in his work, and at the same time he was brazen and brilliant. Oh, that Larry. I was in an unusual place to be with him. I was outed as something special, surprised always by and en route to a mysterious moon. I was an earthling entering something surreal. Larry is from the sky to my earth. He let me in and tells me to push on. I bring him silently an invisible halo. Once I brought him an I Love New York hat and he immediately put it on. He loved it. His aura is inspiration. Grant me more time. Spare Larry and me more time. I never displease him, even when I displease myself. He provides a good lesson in parenting. Only once did I disappoint him, this master. It was the day I mistook plain locks for Nova locks. I accidentally brought him the cheaper kind of salmon. Larry knew quality. Nova was the truest of salmon offerings, he told me. Well, how was I to know? Now I did. Alas, I failed him over a common fish sandwich. Forgive me, I said. He did with a smile. Never again cheap locks. But always again, I'll be there. Till next time. I love you, Larry. Happy birthday. Thank you for being my unexpected, discovered late in life love. You are a dream. I am on your yacht. We will sail. Sleep well, Prince Larry. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you, Sheila. That was poetic indeed. Our next guest is on a tight time schedule, like most of the rest of you, but his schedule is even more so. I'm honored to introduce Dr. Anthony Fauci, who was appointed director of NIAID, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases at the U.S. National Institutes of Health in 1984, 38 years ago. He oversees an extensive research portfolio to prevent, diagnose, and treat infectious diseases such as HIV/AIDS, TB, and malaria, as well as emerging diseases such as Ebola and Zika, with an annual budget of approximately $6.3 billion. He is the chief medical advisor to President Biden. Dr. Fauci actually has advised 7 presidents on HIV/AIDS. He was one of the principal architects of the president's emergency plan for AIDS relief, PEPFAR, a program that has saved millions of lives throughout the developing world. Thank you for gracing us with your presence and a lifetime of service. You're all in your debt. Thank you, Dr. Fauci.
Thank you very much, Barbaralee, and warm greetings to everyone. It is truly a great honor to be part of today's event and to pay tribute to my late and dear friend, Larry Kramer. Larry and I had a long and quite complicated relationship that ultimately culminated in a very deep friendship and affection. We knew each other for about 33 years until his death in 2020. Most people who were heard of but did not know Larry considered him as only a firebrand. But Larry was much more than a firebrand. He cared about people in general and was deeply, deeply committed to the good of the gay community, although at times he frustrated and even enraged them. Larry was a complex man. Case in point, many people in and outside of his orbit did not realize what an extraordinarily sensitive, shy, and warm person he actually was. For example, I will not forget his kindness during the early days of the COVID-19 outbreak when, despite being sick and frail, he became a defender, even a protector of me when he heard that I faced death threats and endless attacks in social media because of my calls for people to follow common sense public measures to slow the spread of SARS-CoV-2. But Larry was not always kind to me, or better said, he did not always appear to be kind to me. At first, our relationship was purely confrontational and adversarial, with him taking me to task at every available opportunity. Yet, even after our friendship was firmly established, his complexity was evident. On the same evening that he would rage against me on national TV, he would call me up at home 1 hour later, concerned that he might have hurt my feelings. That was Larry. To Larry, I represented the federal government because I was one of the few government people in the early and mid-1980s who was out there talking about HIV and AIDS. In his eyes, at the beginning, and even to some extent up until the end, the federal government was the enemy that was not giving enough, doing enough, or using the bully pulpit to call attention to the AIDS crisis. Early on in 1988, he wrote an op-ed to get my attention. It was published on the front page of the San Francisco Examiner Sunday magazine section. Its title was, "I Call You Murderers, an open letter to an incompetent idiot, Dr. Anthony Fauci." He went on to say, quote, "I have been screaming at the National Institutes of Health since I first visited your animal house of horrors in 1984. I called you monsters then and called you idiots in my play, The Normal Heart, and now I call you murderers." Larry wanted to gain my attention, and he certainly succeeded. I very soon began to listen to Larry and what he was actually saying. I realized that behind the iconoclastic behavior, the theatrics, and the salty language, he had very important points to make about getting the community involved in understanding and contributing to the research agenda and clinical trials. Larry was the lightning rod that drew attention to AIDS in ways that previous activists had never done before for any disease. But he was wise enough to surround himself with smart and savvy young activists with the intellectual chops to not only understand the science, but also articulate how research and regulation could be done better and differently by engaging the community. Those activists whom Larry knew as and whom Peter just mentioned were his children. With blunt force, he broke down the doors and let the young activist intellectuals and soon-to-be experts in. Larry and I gradually came to realize that we both were striving for the same thing, stopping the onslaught of AIDS that was taking so many lives, not only in the gay community, but in communities around the world. And so from at first being adversaries, we became collaborators, then colleagues, then very good friends. And working together with his younger acolyte children, the role of activism in the research and regulatory enterprise was forever changed. Activists inspired by Larry pushed hard to accelerate the pace of research to develop better treatments and improve access to potentially life-saving drugs under investigation in clinical trials. As a direct result of this activism, the parallel track program for expanded access to new drugs was launched, as were FDA rules that permitted accelerated approval of treatments for AIDS and other life-threatening diseases based on therapy-induced changes in laboratory markers of disease rather than only clinical endpoints. These regulatory reforms were achieved because activists collaborated with scientists, bioethicists, statisticians, and federal officials. They persuaded different groups to work together to speed up progress in therapeutics and allow earlier access to treatment for people unable to participate in clinical trials. ACT UP and others pushed for the direct involvement of activists and community members in every aspect of the research agenda. These were all extraordinary advances and paved the way for the many therapies now available for people with HIV, and millions of lives were saved. These are the legacies of Larry Kramer. As I mentioned earlier, Larry and I had a long and complicated relationship that reflected somewhat the evolution of the relationship between the activist community and those of us who learned from them. This was best represented by the juxtaposition of the first words that Larry said to me, as I mentioned a moment ago, the now well-known statement that he made in the San Francisco Examiner, "I call you a murderer," with the very last words that we exchanged by phone shortly before he passed. With a raspy, low voice, he said, "I love you, Tony." And I answered back, "I love you too, Larry." It was an enormous privilege to be his friend. And thank you all for allowing me to be here with you today.
Thank you, Dr. Fauci. It was a privilege for us to listen to your words, your deeds, and reflect on your life of service to each and all of us. Thank you again. Our next speaker is architectural designer David Webster. David first met Larry Kramer in the 1970s when Webster ended their relationship for the first time. That was about 50 years ago. The experience inspired Kramer to write Faggots, 1978, which from what I gather is a thinly veiled story of the two of you. They reunited in 1991, and on July 24th, 2013, were married in the intensive care unit of NYU Langone Medical Center while Larry was recovering from surgery. David, his husband, and co-executor of his estate, with a wonderful poster of Larry behind him. You might tell us about that. And you might tell us something about David and Larry. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Barbaralee Diamonstein-Spielvogel, and also Landmarks for honoring Larry. We have a beautiful day today, which seems totally appropriate for this event. One of the great joys of my life was talking to Larry. Talking about him, not so much. I decided, therefore, to let the other eminent speakers help me out, which they have. Faggots, which Barbaralee spoke of, was our love story, and was Larry's way, I think, to regain control of something he didn't understand. It was our story. Ironically, Dinky and Fred, me and Larry, were brought back together and lived here at 2 Fifth Avenue. Simply put, I loved Larry and he loved me. I miss him every day. We had some wonderful days here, affectionate, of course, complicated, and productive. So productive that despite all odds, Larry completed his major novel, The American People. And we had the amazing joy of being, as Barbaralee listed, legally married. I'm very pleased and grateful that Larry and our home here are being recognized this way. The print picture graphic behind me is a collage made by a gay activist, woman artist, Judith. And it is not one piece. It's a collage of Larry put together, and was part of a series that she made of activists. And I thought I needed to have it, so I do. Thank you again for all of you to participate in this, and again, Barbaralee, for the honor.
It is our honor and privilege, and thank you, David. I'm going to ask you to do one more thing. As you all know, this is a virtual program, but there is a real building that they live in, 2 Fifth Avenue, bounded by what 2 streets?
It's between Washington Square South and 8th Street, number 2 Fifth Avenue.
But that is the side facade that faces the arch.
Yes, the Washington Square North. Unfortunately, in the way life played out, Landmark's recognition of Ed Koch made Larry crazy. And it was his request that, as you know, the medallion be put under the space where we live, which is in the small brick annex to the big building, and faces Washington Square.
In fact, that cultural medallion has been placed on the building, was just unveiled, and I'm going to ask David Webster to please read the text of the medallion. And can we have a picture on the screen? There it is, Larry Kramer. Here are the dates. It's not quite so reddish. It was designed pro bono by the internationally recognized designer Massimo Vignelli, and the colors are terracotta, black and white, because it was considered that it would blend in with almost any building type: limestone, brownstone, brick, glass, shingle, whatever. And it mostly works, but this somehow looks quite red. It's terracotta. And would you please read the text, David?
Certainly. Called one of America's most valuable troublemakers by Susan Sontag, gay author and activist Larry Kramer lived here from 1973 until his death. A Yale graduate, 1957, he entered the film industry, writing and producing the Academy Award-winning film of D.H. Lawrence's Women in Love. By the 1970s, he began incorporating gay themes into his work, including his landmark novels, Faggots, 1978, The American Peoples, 2015, and his play, The Normal Heart, 1985, which won the Tony Award in 2011 and was adapted into an Emmy Award-winning film in 2014. In January 1982, with 5 friends, he co-founded Gay Men's Health Crisis, GMHC, in his apartment at 2 Fifth Avenue. It was the world's first HIV/AIDS service organization. And in 1978, he gave a galvanizing speech that led to the founding of the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, ACTA, an international direct action protest movement. He was the recipient of an honorary degree from Yale University and an American Academy of Arts and Letters Award in Literature.
Thank you. This Cultural Medallion Program has been a program of HLPC, which I did create with the help of the designer, Vignelli, as I just described, for nearly 30 years. There are a bit more than 134, I believe, cultural medallions, because there are people who have done remarkable things in each of our 5 boroughs. But if you know of someone who has made a significant contribution and you have verifiable information and you know where they resided or lived or worked or played, but the building must still stand, we do not honor phantom sites. So please let us know. And please keep us informed of your activities. If you want to reach us and interested in our future programs, HLPC, the Historic Landmarks Preservation Center. My name is Barbaralee Diamonstein-Spielvogel. Check our website. You'll find out how to get us directly. I can't thank our guests enough for a memorable program. In many ways, an historic program. Thank you for your caring and your commitment. And thank you, audience, for joining us today to celebrate, to honor the remarkable life and work of Larry Kramer. Thank you.